What's up guys, CT Kidney here, and today I'm going to bring some speculation as to what I would like to see for the datamined third Evoker spec. So if you're unaware, recently there was datamined quests and dialogue suggesting that Evokers are getting a third spec coming into the game for the 10.1 PTR. Now, as for what this is, no one knows for sure, but I've gone into a lot of depth to design what I feel would be a good addition to the class, so without further ado, let's get into it. So currently we have a healer spec and we have a caster DPS spec, so logically we would likely receive a tank spec, melee DPS spec, or another option would be a support spec is something that people have been tossing around. As interesting a choice as a support spec would have been to tackle, I truthfully am not super interested by the idea, as I just don't know how it would fall into the way we play the game now with healers, DPS, and tanks. Many of my concerns with this would be that it would have to provide decent DPS or healing while also providing buffs or debuffs to allies and enemies to have a raid spot. And honestly, I just don't like the idea of a spec purely existing just to buff other people. I'm sure others would like it, but honestly, with the whole power infusion debacle, with people literally griefing runs if they don't get power infusion, I don't think this would be a very great idea for the health of the game. Perhaps if it was balanced perfectly, I could see it having a one raid spot, but you probably wouldn't bring two. And in Mythic Plus, the spots are so contested, I don't think you would ever bring one. The next option was a tank spec, and although it would be cool, it doesn't really work with our talent tree. We are incredibly squishy as it is, and the only defensive talents we get are our defensives, Obsidian Scales and Renewing Blaze, along with a 4% magic damage reduction and a 6% stamina buff. If they did a tank spec, they would have to completely rework the base evoker tree, which I wouldn't really have that much of an issue with, because maybe adding a tank spec would give us some more defensive nodes so we could actually survive encounters. Would definitely help with our squishiness problem. So that only really leaves one option, and that would be a melee DPS spec, and I think this idea works very well as a sort of battle mage kind of archetype that many people have been wanting in the game for so long. The spec I've designed would focus on using the Evoker's magically enhanced strength along with their natural draconic instincts to rip their enemies apart with their claws, teeth, and of course their magic. I tried to strike a good balance between physical and magical attributes of the spec so I could give a good flavor of a more ferocious dragon that still has some aspects of mystic and magical skills. I think these fit well because in many cinematics we see dragons fighting, they actually are using their claws and teeth and magic to fight one another. Whereas with Devastation, we really only use magic and don't really use our claws or teeth at all. With this more primal and visceral thought for a spec, I was running through a lot of names that I could consider for this spec, and I think the best one that fit was Carnage, because it was pretty visceral in the name, and it uses aspects of magic to increase its capabilities from the aspects. So with all that out of the way, what do I think the Carnage Evoker would do? And how would we play it? Firstly, it's going to primarily focus on blue and black color flight spells. Reason being that with a mix of primal physical power and magical enhancements, I thought it would fit best. It scales with intellect to go along with the battle mage theme, and also because our other specs scale with intellect. I mentioned earlier that it does cast spells, so it would only make sense that it scales with intellect. It's going to deal both physical and magical damage, and it focuses on weakening the enemies with both magical and physical debuffs that work together for long damage windows. Now I'm going to get into the abilities that I've given the spec to make it feel more unique, as it's supposed to be melee and devastation is pretty much ranged. Alright, first up is going to be Eldritch Claw. Slash at all enemies in front of you, dealing spell strike damage split among them. It costs 2 essence, it's melee range, and it's on your global cooldown. This is going to be an essence spender that does spell strike damage, which is a combination of arcane and physical. Many of the abilities that I gave them actually do this type of damage because it helps out the flavor of the spec using aspect magic along with their sheer draconic strength. Number 2, Aspectro Maw. This is also going to deal spell strike damage, and if they have both Enfeeble and Languish, which are 2 important debuffs for the spec that I've designed, it's going to do even more damage. And how are we going to apply these debuffs? Well, that's going to be through Arc Lash and Black Talon Lash. So what these are going to do is they're going to apply Enfeeble and Languish, which are the 2 debuffs I mentioned before. However, they're off of our charge spells, so the longer you charge the spell, the longer the duration on the debuff is going to be. Languish is going to increase damage taken by magic, and Enfeeble is going to increase damage taken by physical. And they're both going to have a 30-second cooldown. And because they increase physical and magic damage respectively, that means all of this spell strike damage that we're doing, remember that's arcane and physical damage, is going to be enhanced even further. And then our mastery is going to increase the damage of our empowered spells by X%, whatever the percentage may be of mastery that you have. This mastery is going to enhance what makes evokers so unique, which is their charge spells, and it's something that I felt was really missing in Devastation. It's at this point I would also like to mention that we will have the same baseline evoker abilities such as Azure Strike, Disintegrate, and Fire Breath that every other spec has, and I have some more special things planned for them in the talents. And speaking of talents, yes, I went ahead and designed an entire talent tree just for this one hypothetical spec that I decided to make. So let's go over it. Alright, so we're going to go from left to right and talk about every single one of these talents that I designed and how they will impact the spec, any synergies they have. Let's get into it. First up is going to be Azure Attune. And what this is going to do is it's going to increase Azure Strike's damage by 250%, but give it a cooldown of 5 seconds and make it melee range. This turns Azure Strike into our filler spell by making it melee, but also increasing the damage and giving it a CD. But because it's made melee, it's better for our melee playstyle, and we won't just be spamming Azure Strike over and over and over and over again because it has a cooldown, which can be kind of boring. Next up is going to be Black Talon Lash. This deals spell strike damage and applies Languish for 5 seconds per levels of charge. Remember, there are 4 levels of charge, so that means that you will be able to apply it for a total of 20 seconds. And as I already stated, it's going to deal spell strike damage, apply Languish, and the longer duration is a longer charge. Spellclaw Assault. This is going to allow you to use auto attacks while channeling Disintegrate. This solves a major problem that I saw when making the spec, and that was if we're casting a lot, we're not auto attacking a lot, and then how could we really be a melee spec if we don't auto attack? This allows for auto attacks while you're casting Disintegrate, which is going to become more important further down the tree. Next up is Catalyst Rush. So dealing spell strike damage has a small chance to increase the duration of Eruption Catalyst, which is going to be our main cooldown, by 0.15 to 0.30 seconds. And I know it may not seem like a lot, but once we get to the actual cooldown itself, it'll make a lot more sense. It's also very good because Catalyst Rush says that every time you deal spell strike damage, and we do quite a bit of spell strike damage. Next up is Essence Burst. Of course I had to put Essence Burst in here, it's in the other 2 specs, and I decided to let it proc on Azure Strike, which is our filler spell, and also added auto attacks so that we would actually get some value from our auto attacks. Not that it would have the same proc chance as Azure Strike of proccing this, but I was thinking maybe like a 5 to 10% chance on auto attacks and like a 25% chance on Azure Strike. Next up is going to be Arc Lash, and this is going to deal spell strike damage and also apply Enfeeble for 5 seconds per level of charge. Enfeeble increases physical damage taken by 5%. Once again, as mentioned before, the longer the charge, the longer the duration of Enfeeble. And these 2 debuffs, Enfeeble and Languish, are going to be our very important debuffs that we want to keep up as much as possible. Cavernous Strikes is going to be next, and what it's going to do is it's going to give Languish a dot for 15% of Black Talon Slash's damage. This is going to work really well with Mastery because the dot is based off of Black Talon Lash's damage, and once again because it deals spell strike damage, it would be increased even further by Enfeeble and Languish. Revel in Superiority. What this is going to do is it's going to allow Deep Breath to apply both Enfeeble and Languish for 10 seconds. With Deep Breath being the only real Black Dragon spell that we have baseline, I had to do something with it to make it work here. It's also just one of my favorite spells, and applying both of the debuffs I came up with at the same time seems to make it really useful on AoE and definitely probably still useful on single target. Flex Breaker. Spending Essence increases your crit chance by 5% for 10 seconds. This is probably going to be up the majority, if not all of the time, especially later in the fight that I'll get into later. Just a flat 5% buff when you spend Essence, and yes, it would work with Essence Burst. Wither. Enfeeble is going to increase physical damage done by an additional 2%. I didn't want to just make this have a dot like I did with Languish, so I decided to just increase the percentage damage done. Improved Eldritch Claw. This just makes it so that you can use Eldritch Claw more often by reducing the essence cost by 1, and also means you'll probably get more disintegrates in as well. Flaming Burst. So this is the first talent that has to do with flame breath, and what it's going to do is it's going to reduce the range to 10 yards but increase its damage and charge speed by 30%. This makes flame breath better suited for melee combat with the reduced charge time and damage. I feel the damage increase was needed since it deals fire damage instead of spell strike damage like most of the rest of our spells. It also has some other nodes coming up later. Eruption Catalyst. So this is going to be our main cooldown. For 10 seconds, any damage you deal to the target is replicated and stored, unleashing when this expires. This is going to be our main cooldown, like I said, and I thought lining up this cooldown with our empowered spells and other damage increases would be super fun for a burst window, where you go all out for just 10 seconds on an enemy and then have it reactivated on expiration to deal all that damage again. Plus, it also shares a cooldown with Deep Breath being 2 minutes, and that would lead to some pretty amazing burst if you take Revelant Superiority. Next up, good old-fashioned Font of Magic. You just get one more essence. I mostly just threw this in here because it's in the other 2 specs. Mystical Maul. This is going to cause Disintegrate to deal Spell Strike damage. So because Disintegrate is going to deal Spell Strike damage, it makes it more effective when we have both Languish and Enfeeble up, as it buffs both of them, and also synergizes well with Catalyst Rush, adding duration to our cooldown. The next one is going to be a Fire Breath node, and this is going to be Flame Management. And what that does is it's going to extend Languish by 1 to 2 seconds per level of charge. This is going to be another reason why we want to full charge our Empower spells, because I really felt like that was something that was lacking in Devastation, that we really only used our empowered spells to the first level, and that never quite made a lot of sense to me, at least on single target. Also, it would have fantastic synergy with Tip the Scales, allowing for an instant full charge Fire Breath that would extend the duration of your debuffs. Next up is going to be Ruby Sparks. Dealing fire damage has a chance to flare, dealing damage around you. This is just a good way to help out our Fire Breath. Again, seeing as it does fire damage and not spell strike damage, I didn't want to make it totally useless, so I said, hey, why not just make it decent in AoE? I really like this next one, and what it is, it's Chromatic Teachings. Dealing damage with a black or blue spell increases the damage of the other by 7.5 to 15%. This would spice up the rotation quite a bit, and I honestly just stole the idea from the Capstone and the Discipline Priest tree, but I think it works really well here. Swapping between black and blue spells to deal more damage would make for a much more fun rotation than just hitting the same button over and over again. Next up is going to be Mass Deconstruction. What it's going to do is allow Disintegrate to chain to 2 to 4 enemies and spread Enfeeble and Languish, but it deals half the damage. This would allow for you to spread your debuffs, but you wouldn't want to take it on single target since it reduces the damage of Disintegrate. I decided to reduce the damage because just having AoE Disintegrate would probably be way too strong, and it would make Eldritch Claw, the ability that I made up, pretty useless. You could pair the two and go back to back with Chromatic Teachings, the talent that I just mentioned before, since one is a blue Dragonflight spell and the other is a black Dragonflight spell. Next up is going to be Extinction Burst. What this does is it just allows you to do a burst of damage after fully channeling Disintegrate. This is going to be some incentive to fully channel Disintegrate if you can, since there's no need for clipping in this spec, it's just a bonus. Alright, and this is going to be one of our choice nodes, Cleaving Magics and a Spectral Enemy. What this is going to do is it's going to give Eldritch Claw 5% more damage per target it hits, or it's going to allow it to do 50% more damage but only hit one target. This is just a choice node between single target or AoE, really nothing special. It's just going to, define how you use this ability. Next up is going to be Nimble Spellweaver, and what this is going to do is it's going to allow you to use empowered spells while hover is active. This was a common problem that I kept facing when designing the spec, is that the melee playstyle and charging spells do not mix. So I decided to alleviate some of that pressure by allowing hover, which normally won't let you cast empowered spells, to actually let you do it, since there are 3 of them in this spec, and needing to move in order to stop charging your spells is one of the most annoying things when you play Devastation, and it would be 10 times worse in melee. It also adds hover weaving to the spec, which I like a lot in Devastation because it adds a little bit of skill expression. Next up is going to be Draconic Frenzy. It's going to increase your attack speed by 0.25% per 1% of missing health on the enemy. This talent once again makes auto attacks better and gives a good execute type playstyle as well, because remember, hitting more auto attacks also gives you a chance to get more essence bursts the lower on health the enemy is. Because you're auto attacking more, you get more chances to get essence burst. Next up is going to be anticipation. This is going to have Eldritch Claw increase the damage of Black Talon Lash by 3%, stacking up to 10 times. This has amazing synergy with Mastery, buffing Black Talon Lash, and also has good synergy with Cavernous Strikes, because the dot from Cavernous Strikes is purely based off of the damage from Black Talon Lash. Next up is going to be Carnal Instinct, and what this does is auto attacks, again, on an enemy with both Languish and Enfeeble have a chance to reset as Spectral Maw. This ability increases the rewards for keeping both debuffs up, having a chance to reset your Spectral Maw, and Spectral Maw in itself does more damage if both of these debuffs are on the enemies. Incantation Specialist. This makes your empowered spells reduce the cooldown on other empowered spells by 0.5 seconds per charged level. Again, another incentive to fully charge your spells and a little bit of cooldown reduction as well. Also very good with Tip the Scales because it's instant and would reduce the cooldown on your other empowered spells that are currently on cooldown by about 2 seconds. It also has great synergy with Flame Management because you want to charge Fire Breath as much as possible anyway. The next talent is going to be Neltharion's Ire. Auto attacks on targets apply a stack of Neltharion's Ire, and when you use an empowered spell, it explodes all of those stacks of Neltharion's Ire to do more damage. Again, another talent that revolves around auto attacks, making sure you really want to get those auto attacks in when you can, and again, has really good synergy with Demonic Frenzy because you auto attack more, so you'd apply more stacks, making your execute phase a little bit better. Next up is going to be Quick Claws, and what this is going to do is reduce the charge time of Black Talon Lash. Again, this is another way to deal with the stress of having to cast empowered abilities in melee range, but it also makes it easier to get the maximum duration of Languish because you charge it for less time. Pressing attacks. What this is going to do is it's going to allow you to do 1 to 2% more damage if you have both Enfeeble and Languish on the target. Again, more incentive to just keep both of these debuffs up for as long as you possibly can. Lifebinder's Aura. Fire Breath creates an aura around you dealing fire damage every 3 seconds. Again, another way for Fire Breath to be really good, because it's a separate instance of fire damage, it would also help proc more Ruby Sparks. Next up is Focus Strikes. Eruption Catalyst causes your target to take a flat more damage from your attacks. This is just a good way to improve the effectiveness of your cooldown, and it also runs into a capstone that I'll talk about in a second that has more to do with Eruption Catalyst. Honed Skills. Auto attack critical strikes increase spell critical strike chance by 2.5 to 5%. Yet another auto attack enhancer, just an extra crit chance building up from your spells as you attack with your claws. And next we have Aspect's Boon, our first capstone, and what this is going to do is increase the damage of Black Talon Slash and Arc Slash by 25%. This isn't going to be super playstyle defining, but definitely very good for buffing our empowered spells, which makes Mastery even more effective and also plays well with Carnivorous Strikes, Anticipation, and Incantation Specialists. Our next capstone is going to be Forever Weak. What this is going to do is refresh the duration on Enfeeble, Languish, and Eruption Catalyst on the target. Something to note is that this will not refresh them on all the targets, it'll only refresh them on one target. So you could do some really interesting things with this. Firstly, it could refresh a maximum duration Enfeeble or Languish if you can get them, but also make Eruption Catalyst much better and has amazing synergy with Catalyst Rush, which would add more duration to it after it refreshes. And also, it's a 2-minute cooldown, which means you would get it every Eruption Catalyst. Our third capstone is going to be Cataclysmic Catalyst. What this is going to do is allow Eruption Catalyst, which is our cooldown, to deal half its damage to enemies near the target. So what it does is normally Eruption Catalyst would be a single target spell. However, this is going to make it AoE. So the more damage you can build up on the primary target, when it explodes, it's going to explode for that damage or half of that damage to everything around it. Just a cool burst AoE option. Next up is Monstrous Strength, and what this is going to do is it's going to give Black Talon Lash and Arc Slash the ability to hit all enemies in front of them for 25% of their damage. So it's going to be really great for applying your 2 debuffs to multiple enemies, and it's going to do it instantly so you won't have to take mass deconstruction. It also works well with Forever Weak because it'll refresh the duration on the target, and it would work really well with Aspect's boon that increases the damage of these two spells directly. And that's going to be all of the talents I had for this setup. So with the talents out of the way, hopefully you can see a picture of how the spec would play, applying and maintaining these two debuffs that would do a bunch of cool things, and then charging empowered spells as much as you possibly can while playing around with the cooldowns to deal a massive amount of damage, staying in melee range as much as possible to get the auto attacks for your essence bursts and your Neltharian's Ire stacks and whatever you would else do with auto attacks. As far as the playstyle goes, I can see a great single target setup taking Aspect's boon for giant empowered spells and increasing the duration on both Languish and Enfeeble with flame management, and then using Tip the Scales, Fire Breath to increase that duration even further when you pop Forever Weak to actually give it a huge time refresh. All the while in your down phase, swapping between Disintegrate, Eldritch Claw, and Azure Strike for Chromatic Teachings buffs. And on top of that, I could also see a really cool AoE playstyle based around building a massive Black Talon Lash with Aspect's boon, Monstrous Strength, and Anticipation, creating a huge massive dot with Cavernous Strikes, or a more bursty cleave build with Cataclysmic Catalyst and focused on more building up a giant catalyst and then popping it right when ads spawn on a boss fight, or like the very end of a Mythic Plus pull, you can do hella damage with it. There's so many different options that I would love to see what people would do with it. I personally would adore something like this spec coming into a game, but I guess I am a little bit biased because, you know, I made it. I could see Mastery being our best stat easily, maybe followed by Haste because of the reliance on our auto attacks, but definitely Mastery first because it would increase the damage of all of our empowered spells, which would absolutely truck. So what do you think? If we are going to get a new spec, I would hope personally that it's something like this. But this was just me doing some armchair game design. Let me know what you guys thought. Would you enjoy a third spec? What do you think our third spec would be? What do you think you could make for the new Evoker spec? Would you want it to be something like this? Would you want it to be something totally different? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see y'all next time.